So today, it's not really that kind of Hallmark kind of holiday. Christ the King Sunday is a little tricky as to how that works. But I was mindful of the fact that as we gather in the United States, in Palo Alto, there is a lot of king language that has been part of our recent history and language here in America in modern times and in the past. One of the things that Marielle and I have been doing is watching Ken Burns' new documentary on the American Revolution. And if you're not watching it, you should be. It is amazing. And as you might imagine, kings come up in that story. And so there is the King of England, and we're going to dump your tea into the harbor, and there's a lot of all of that kind of business. But this idea of a king. But at the same time, when we think of those over us, I think it would be a mistake not to reference protests that were recently held that had the theme, No Kings, right? I saw a hat the other day that said, No Kings since 1776. And this idea of kings is one that conjures up all kinds of images for us. Some of them are problematic. Some of them, particularly if it's England and it doesn't affect us, and there's a lot of really cool wardrobe things we get kind of excited about. But this idea of a king and the kind of leadership that a king brings, or doesn't bring, or could bring, but chooses not to, or who knows what, brings us to a funny place when we think of today's reading and the focus of today as Christ the King Sunday. The idea that people, just because of who they are in charge, and what kind of leadership do they bring? I was thinking about this idea of monarchy and nobility as I was reflecting on today's sermon, and it took me back to one of the great classic films of American history. Came out 20 years ago or so. Some of you may recall its title is Shrek. Shrek is an animated film, the story of a friendly, kindly, warm-hearted ogre, right? And everybody is scared of him because he's an ogre, and he's in the woods and this sort of thing. But then comes the nobleman. The nobleman is going to rout him out of the forest, and Lord Farquaad gets all of his soldiers in place and is giving them a pep talk before they head into the woods. And he's talking about how dangerous this is going to be. And some of you may die, but it is a risk that I am willing to take. Some of you may die, but it is a risk that I am willing to take. What kind of leadership, right? Leadership that centers the self, leadership that centers cruelty, perhaps violence over others, leadership that doesn't lose sleep over the loss of life, leadership that between two paths of equal value might take a little moment to understand what might be the crueler path to take. That is not Christ the King Sunday. Now think about it. You have a Bible in front of you. We could pour through the Gospels and we can think of a lot of stories about Jesus, right? We're coming up soon to that time when he's born. We can think of miracles, water to wine, healing the blind. We can think of feeding the thousands. We can think of him before Pilate. What text would we choose to read on Christ the King Sunday? But a text that is about Christ on the cross. A leader, a king who sacrifices self for others. Not for personal gain, personal enrichment, but for the sake of the other. That is the Christian model. This idea of having empathy towards others is from Christ. From Christ. Now, when we think of the text that we have for today, Jesus is on a cross. From the Roman perspective, we have 3 criminals up there, but the criminals are talking back to Jesus. Everybody is heckling Jesus. And one of the criminals heckles him and says, "Yeah, save us too." And the other one says, "Hey, we deserve what we're getting, but he does not." And then a phrase that is difficult. These are phrases that are placed in music all the time. It's hard not to sing it. But Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus' response is, today you will be with me in paradise. The idea that there is a kingdom of heaven, where our citizenship is. And I think that's one of the things that is hard for us to remember as people of faith, because we are so consumed with what is physically in front of us, or what comes in through our media and the news and various people at various levels of our government, or whatever the case might be. To remember when we gather in this space and are sent out from this space, that we are reminded that we are citizens of heaven, and that Christ is our King. And our first loyalty is to him. Our first loyalty. Not our second or third, not our when it's convenient, or not our, well, as long as it's not a problem with my local authorities, or not if it's going to put me in the wrong social group at work or at school or whatever the case might be. But Christ calls on us first. That is our citizenship. Now, this idea of being at the end of the church year and being reminded of the idea that Christ is our King throughout the year, which is almost circular in a fashion, we have this understanding that we take moments of time to remember things that we should be trying to keep in our heads all the time. But we have to move through them through the year. This idea that Christ is our King, that we are citizens in heaven, and that our King has modeled for us what leadership should look like, that it is self-sacrificing, that is first for the other, for the broken, for those who are struggling, for those who are at the margin first. That it is not about violence or cruelty, but rather it is for health and wholeness and grace and well-being. This is the model. And in a world that is a bit chaotic right now, with a lot of very unhealthy and hurtful models of leadership, we are called to live differently in this life. Amen. Please stand as you are able.